welcome. Good afternoon, good afternoon. It's so good to see you all. Thank you for braving the glorious weather and deciding to make time for an incredible pair of conversations this afternoon. My name is Andrew Westover, and I'm the Eleanor McDonald Storza Deputy Director for Learning and Civic Engagement here at the High. I want to thank you for joining us for today's panel, The Truth Superb Surprise, Conversations on Documentary Photography. A special thank you to High Museum members and attendants. Your support is invaluable and fuels our mission. If you are not yet a member of the museum or need to renew, please visit high.org at the end of this program. This program is in conjunction, of course, with our current exhibition, Truth Told Slant, Contemporary Photography, which was organized by the High Museum of Art. The exhibition is currently on view, and if you haven't already seen it, you must. Feel free to do so immediately after this program. And your ticket to this panel does include admission to the museum, so use it. This exhibition was made possible by funding from our exhibition series donors, Delta Airlines Incorporated, ACT Foundation Incorporated, William N. Banks Jr., Mr. Joseph H. Boland Jr., the Cousins Foundation, Burton M. Gold, Sarah and Jim Kennedy, Harry Norman Realtors, Wish Foundation, and Benefactor Exhibition Series supporters Robin and Hilton Howell. And thank you to the full High team for their essential support to make this program happen. Today's conversation, as you may know, is split into two panels and includes 4 of the artists featured in the exhibition. This pair of panels has a lot of ground to cover. We'll be delving into the slipperiness between photography's perceived objectivity and the ways it can elicit doubt. The first conversation, between Joel Frank and Tommy Keough, will address the intersection of documentary and autobiography to explore how photographs are used to articulate and communicate identity. No big task, it'll be great. The second conversation, between Rosemary Cromwell and Kristine Potter, will consider the limitations of the medium and how these photographers employ speculation, performance, and immersive visual experiences to engage viewers. Gregory Harris, Donald and Marilyn Keough, Family Curator of Photography, will moderate both conversations. And I'm excited to share, too, that coffee and light bites will be available outside during a break between both conversations. So now, please join me in welcoming Greg, Jill, and Tommy.
Thank you, Andrew, and thank you all for coming out today, especially on such a lovely, sunny Atlanta day. So we're just going to dive right in. I'm going to assume that everyone has seen the exhibition or at least done some homework about what the show is about, and we're just going to dive right in. But as you'll see, there are installation shots of the exhibition scrolling behind us, along with images of everyone's work. So that'll give you a sense for the exhibition, and hopefully, either during the break or after the conversation, you'll have a chance to go see the exhibition. So starting off with kind of a big, broad question for both of you. Kind of picking up on the broadest theme of the exhibition, like how do you think about your work in relation to traditions of documentary practice? And within that, what are some of the challenges that you encounter when making pictures that are about the world? And what approaches do you use to mitigate those concerns?
Okay. So I drew the short straw. I guess a little context. So I went to Yale University, and a lot of the photography Walker Evans founded the program, so there was a lot of street photography influence. I don't think they really were trying to affect the way I was working. I was coming from Memphis, and a lot of my work has been very staged about other people. I was making self-portraits, and I always felt that there was a bit of always an inherent stagedness of even planning to bring a camera with me, that there is a level of what is real, what is stage, and I kind of started to try to kind of be a little bit ambivalent but also open about what the pictures that I was making could be. And then I forgot the other 2 questions. So this is really great, great start.
You both make pictures that are like very clearly about the world, and there are some elements of staging, but you work in a way that is representational, observational, and there are some challenges that come along with trying to depict the world in an authentic, genuine, truthful way. So what are some of the challenges that you encounter in trying to make those kinds of pictures, and then what are the ways that you try to mitigate some of those challenges?
Well, I think I started to involve more people when I started doing more self-portraits and having to share the frame, and really kind of confusing the kind of thing that happens with self-portraiture. It really puts the artist in the center. But I was really interested in expanding the collaboration between the camera operator and the sitter, and trying to be able to kind of reach a authenticity between like what I had in mind, but what I couldn't plan with other people, that I ended up using like really small things of having sketch things out or write things of what I want the photographic setup to be, and ending up through sequencing and editing, just picking ones that weren't intentional, like small things like if someone's about to sneeze or make a expression that I wasn't expecting. That I really like the idea of like planning so much before the whole picture ends up not actually fulfilling all of that. And I like the kind of near failure of not completing all or arriving at a setup or a documentary, but kind of having living in that kind of terrain of being both. I want. It sounds like I'm trying to have my cake and eat it too, but I really wanted to find this, arrive at a picture that is both a shared experience, but that has something real to it, but also like not hiding the fact that this is a stage. This camera's on a tripod. This camera has things performed in front of it, but the performance is real sometimes, or like I'm arriving into something that was already happening through the space or the interiors. But yeah.
Sorry.
Yeah.
Before we move on, does that apply with pictures that don't have people in them as well? With pictures that don't have people in them?
Yeah, I think there's just something catching my eye, or having a bit of kind of validation that these spaces may not necessarily record a sort of presence, because that's been what I've been thinking about, how much my work in the show has been recording invisibility in history, and how do you do that when history doesn't record that? And so these interior spaces that I'm really drawn to, people's like pictures of people, other people's pictures hanging on the wall, or the spaces that are curated by multiple people and arriving at the space is almost like a set. It's almost like a stage to me already, and then having the camera already with me is, I really like that level of, it is staged, but it's also real. Like there's nothing really changed. I don't tend to move objects, or if I have to arrange the composition, I move my body into space with the camera, and just try to have this kind of song and dance to find that kind of realness. So.
How about you, Jill? I mean, do you think about your work in terms of kind of traditional ideas of documentary?
Turn this on. No.
Yeah.
It's on?
You just have to hold it closer to your mouth.
Oh. Okay, that's a win. Well, I benefit a lot from the parameters of documentary practice. So for me, I always think about how the real world is like constantly delivering really interesting things, and it's my job to parse them out and be willing to fail a lot in order to, make the pictures that I want to make. So a lot of my practice involves walking up to people I don't know, sometimes with a really cumbersome camera, and asking them if I can take their picture, clumsily explaining where the picture might go and what might happen to it. So, it looks something like this. Can I take your picture? I don't know. What is this for? Well, best case scenario, it goes into a museum, or a group show. Worst case scenario, I don't even bother to scan it because I screwed it, But I try to be as honest as I can, because over the years in photographing people, strangers and people I don't know, I've had to come to terms with the fact that half of the people are bummed that I messed up the picture and it didn't go anywhere, and half the people are bummed that I'm using it all the time and they don't love the way they look in it. So I think, just talking about documentary practice as this practice of like trying to view the world and trying to record the world, that's, fundamental to what I do. And I wouldn't have a practice without utilizing those parameters. You said, how do I mitigate the...
Yeah, I mean, I guess where that question is coming from is like my sense is that there's a lot of academic criticism of photographers who take, pictures that are supposed to kind of tell a story, speak to some kind of truth or fact, to present some kind of objectivity, that are, kind of like, the man on the street kind of picture, and that there's a lot of legitimate criticisms that come out from that. And I think one of the things that unites all of the artists in the exhibition is that you all are thinking about that and yet are not deterred by those criticisms to still go out and try to engage with the world. And so I wonder, like, and there seems to be, sometimes, maybe a strategy is a little too on the nose for it, but there's an approach to the way that you make pictures, which kind of leads into the next question. Like, particularly with your work, Jill, there's like the ideas around consent, collaboration are really important to how you make your pictures, because you can't do it on the sly. So I'm curious, like, how, you touched on it a little bit, like walk us through a little bit more of like how you make the picture and kind of what that interaction is like, and then how that results in the photograph that we see on the walls.
Get ready for some awkward, it's not very graceful, but it's what I like to do, so I'm completely comfortable with it. But, I work entirely with strangers now, recently, so all of the photographs in the show, Truth Told Slant, are people that I knew for minutes, in maybe one or two cases for hours, and very lightly. So I think there's something really important about acknowledging, that consent comes after I've talked about who I am as an artist and, again, what these possibilities for where the photograph might go, what it could be, what it might be, and what they're comfortable with. And in this particular exhibition, I photographed, a substantial amount of 10-year-olds, and that involves several layers of permission. That involves often contacting a school, then working with a teacher, then working with parents, and then, most importantly, asking the child if they want to be in the photograph or how they want to be in the photograph. And, those layers can also be, it reminded me of applying to tenure, just as a side note. Okay, it's like, because that process, just FYI, it's like you constantly have to say what you want to do over and over again, and that's how you feel sometimes. You're like, again to the teacher, okay, I really hope that I make these pictures that reveal some of the complexities of what it was like to be 10 years old, what it was like to be in these situations that were, hyper social and lots of pressure. I don't know if I'll succeed, but this is what I'm hoping to do. And these kind of constant conversations where you're expressing your desire, but you're also leaving a lot of space for this person to express themselves and have a lot of agency. So the question started out with...
You're doing great.
Oh, okay. Well...
process,
okay.
And then also like the ways that collaboration and consent, because they're
collaboration,
kind of linked,
yes. Yes. This is my theory about the view camera. Everyone who uses it, I know there's like half of you out there are in love with the view camera the way that I am. It's expensive and cumbersome, very expensive, increasingly expensive. But it's also a tool that has, in many ways, a built-in layer of consent. And I think this is something that a lot of people don't talk about, but it's a huge part of why I use it. Because by the time you've set it up, by the time you've focused, by the time you've communicated with people, especially the type of portrait that I make, which is usually a three-quarter, portrait that's very close and, attempting to do some, unflattening of a cliche moment, you've definitely decided to pose in that picture, right? There's no sneaking up on people. And I love that about the 4x5. And I think it's something that I just don't hear people talk about a lot, but it's one of the primary reasons that I use it. I do also use a digital camera sometimes, and I find that with that camera, I have to add in some speed changes. Like I have to move slower with a digital camera because I need that extra time and that extra sort of like conversation to make sure that everyone's on the same page. So I think consent is huge and built in a little bit to how you use the large format camera. And if you're not familiar with it, which I'm guessing this audience is, it's the one where you go under the blanket, you focus, you have to tell them you want to focus again, you focus again, your light changed, the sun went behind a cloud, you have to focus again. You know, by that time, their pose has definitely changed and you focus again. So, you know, the process, like I said, the process isn't always glamorous, but it does allow for some of that to be built in, so.
And how does this come into your work too? Because you touched on this a little bit, but a lot of your pictures are posed, staged. I mean, not to say that there isn't spontaneity in it, but you're kind of arranging the situation and letting something happen.
Yeah, I think just to finish the first question is just like, I actually don't really consciously, I think we talked about it too, I don't really consciously think of myself as like self-portraiture or documentary. I want to be able or capable to make all kinds of pictures because I love photography. But I mean, also I switch up formats, I switch up cameras over the years, but I mean, like once I found a camera I love, I stick with it until, well, I don't know how to, I mean, I think I'm still in like 3 relationships. I don't know how to end things, guys. And projects, relationships, applications.
This is a public therapy session now?
Yeah. I'm just so used to sitting down in front of people and just like, oh, therapy, it's like Yale again. I don't know, I kind of just try to have a little bit of openness, but I also want to be sincere about how I arrive at the picture. I don't want to lie to people. I don't want to give people the wrong idea of what I'm doing in the space because, you know, especially if you're like an artist of otherness, like we have to explain ourselves all the time what we're doing in the room. So I'm also like having to address like personal things of not just historical. There's no, we're not accounted for, artists of color or people of color, immigrants, children of immigrants, queer people. We're just not historically in the archive a lot of the times. The things are changing now, but I'm trying to have a bit of fun with it. You can't spell fun without F-U. But yeah, I just like, I kind of want to explore the different kinds of styles that does invite, when I do photograph people, there is like, still the consent is important. Like being in front of the camera, trying to arrive at a respectful collaboration, no matter how long or brief, or I've used a lot of people over the years and revisit them and meet strangers and then somehow meet them again. But yeah, I try to just be open about how my work is, but also I think it runs in parallel with how people, I guess, people always have a certain idea of me, and it just like reminds me of the Ann Arbus' quote of like, you can't help what there comes a point when what you want people to know about you and what you can't help what people know about you. And I think those are the things I feel are more conscious when I point the camera at something, so.
So one of the things that I noticed in both of your work is that a starting point for both of you seems to be vernacular pictures in one form, or pictures that were not made with any kind of artistic intent. So Jill, your work, you photograph a lot of young people, as you mentioned. But so how do you, and you're a college professor, so you you all get extra credit. Yeah. How do you see young people using photographs to tell their stories, to articulate their identities, and what cues are you taking from those practices when making your own pictures?
That's a good question. I think generationally, at least, the younger generations have an agency and a familiarity and a brilliance with how they use cameras to express themselves. You know, obviously these tools weren't available to me in the 80s and 90s when I was, you know, at the age of the people that I'm primarily photographing. So, you know, I think that there's that, just basic element. And then I think, generationally speaking, there's also a distance that allows me to reflect a little bit without the tension. You know, I'm not in the moment of social performance. You know, I'm completely removed from it. You know, the amazing thing about aging is you stop caring about a lot of the ways that people see you and perceive you and judge you. But certainly younger people, you're in the height of it and you're in the most tense part of it. But with that, I will also say, I think sometimes when I hear people describe the photographs I take, I hear things like, your work is dealing with identity, or your work is telling us who these people are. And I think to myself, I'm not really telling you anything about them because I don't know them. I'm dealing entirely in the world of appearances, like what something looks like, because that's all I can do. That's all the camera can do. And I think that if there's something to be learned about identity from the photographs that I take, it's because that person, that subject, has a certain fluency and agency in how to present themselves to the camera, And I think a lot of my work, or a lot of my intention with my work, is to interrogate the pose a little bit, how people present themselves to the camera. That's really interesting to me. And I think that we don't always talk about it. We don't always say, oh, if you were to ask us to pose up here and I were to flatten myself and present myself to you, I'm changing, obviously, in the presence of the camera. And this is sort of age-old photo conversation, age-old theory, but it really matters, and it really plays into how the portraits manifest. Did I answer it? Okay.
Yeah.
Oh, okay. There you go.
So Tommy, you take a lot of pictures of other people's pictures. I mean, one of the pieces in the show that kind of wraps the corner is a picture of a friend's grandmother's living room that's just covered with studio portraits of people, gentle shelving and looking their best. And you also, gentle shelf, you don't know?
That's great.
Our next show.
A whole show on the gentle shelf. And then you also take a lot of pictures of the pictures that are just like out in the world, in restaurants and on the street, things like that. So what interests you about vernacular photographs, and how do you incorporate that into your own work?
I think the vernacular really is the snapshot. I was born and raised in Memphis, and Eggleston, Christian Berry, and a bit, I would say Sally Mann too, has a bit of influence in the way I handle the camera. I even use like the 4x5, which is so blasphemy to be like, yeah, I don't straighten out the lines. I just want to make a picture, but man, people are so mad. I was like, oh, that's not what the 4x5 is. But I love the historical nature of the studio camera. Like the view camera is so related to the early on in photo studios, like 1840s and the 50s, really tied into imperialistic interests and how the camera traveled or got to other places during that time. And I'm not getting off this train of thought early on, so I'm gonna keep on going. In the photo studio, like those pictures people are coming in, they're making these pictures in collaboration with the studio, but they're not going on art gallery walls. They're going onto the hearth, they're going on in the family album. So there's a lot of proto snapshots to that effect. So I kind of feel like no matter the style, there's a little bit of connection to each other. But I take pictures of other people's archives because my family are immigrants. They have a different relationship to photography. They're more concerned about surviving a war. And then when they did, my mom made pictures, and I didn't know this until she gifted me an album like 5-6 years into photographing together. And she never explained it, but I really like the difference between generation of where I'm educated in the West and in America, and my mom never had that opportunity. So photography for them is just this thing that you hang on the wall. That it's not really. They don't hang it on the wall. All of it went into a shoebox. Like there's maybe like a family album, but I love that kind of the relationship between that and between just within a generation. Like it's so different. And I think to photograph other people's archives is to rewind the absence that I didn't grow up with that. I didn't grow up with like that many pictures on the wall. We do now, but it's this kind of weird thing to go to other people's homes and see like their lives going back generations, and we're just starting in a new country essentially, or at least my mom. And to do the snapshots installation in Truth Told Slant, I love the idea that I'm thinking about photography in 3 tiers. One, that photography is like a modern day ghost hunting and an exorcism. And then second, photography or picture making is really an act of time travel. And then the third is like photography is language, and language is a communal activity. So I'm just trying to cast a net to find people that speak the same dialect, slang, have the same accents to me. So, yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about the self-portrait of like, well, I guess, the one of you and your mother before the backdrop, because
Yeah.
I think that kind of connects back to like this tradition of studio portraiture. It's a really interesting kind of tongue-in-cheek photograph. Just to talk about that one for a little bit.
I think she's holding a mirror and a shutter cable. So I put it to, I usually have people I'm photographing now hold a cable release that is often like, I think is a shorthand because Pixie the Owl did it, but a lot of photographers would use it as like a test subject, but also a shorthand way to point back to the photographer, the camera operator. But the joke's on all of us because like the camera's on a self-timer and there's no photographer. So my mom's just squeezing the ball and like nothing's happening. But that's the thing, like I can't plan what her reaction is, but I love that kind of realness that comes from the setup and then it falls apart because it doesn't follow the rules of it. But then the camera takes the picture. So I love like setting up situations like that. And you know, before that we made that picture, we weren't speaking to each other for a while because of a lot of political things that were going on that we definitely disagreed on. So before, like when we have these shoots together, my mom would know when I'm in town, just like, oh, I'm off on Tuesday, I'll make us lunch, but if you want to come by earlier, we can make some pictures, and then that's usually how our relationship is, this kind of neutral photo shoot thing that kind of happens with people, I think. With anybody I photograph, there's such a weird space that allows us to exist. I love that.
Never a dull moment. So Jill, when I look at your pictures, I feel like there's a sense of intimacy or at least familiarity with the people that you're photographing. Yet the work isn't about you, it's not about your own life. And there's a distance, specifically like a generational difference between you and the people that you photograph. So what are some of the advantages that you encounter with being, I guess, an outsider? Because you're not photographing your own community or yourself. And then what might be the pitfalls? And I think there's also the sense of like, if you're an outsider, you're observing this other culture, that there's this kind of anthropological fascination. And I don't get that in your work, so I'm curious, like, how do you avoid creating that feeling in the pictures?
That's a good question. So I think I use formal photo language specifically to make sure that you know that I'm an outsider, right? Like in many ways, like I'm not taking pictures that I would take of a friend when we're relaxed. For the most part, all of the photographs I'm taking, they're large scale, they're really detailed, and they're incredibly familiar poses, right, from Renaissance descended portraiture. Like these are formal photographs. And I use formality specifically because it implies a distance between myself and the sitter. And then the other thing that I'm really committed to is using photographic perspective to make sure that there's information for the viewer about where I am and what point of privilege I have with the person I'm photographing. So in the homecoming pictures, for instance, they're all photographed very much from, oh wow, I timed
Great
that.
timing.
They're all photographed from the side, and they're all lit in a way that is not very intuitive, right? I'm trying to imply through the use of lighting that the light is not coming from me, from my setup. I'm trying to imply that the light is actually coming from the official homecoming photographer, and that I'm actually at a very unprivileged angle off to the side, photographing them while they're being photographed for the official homecoming photographer. Because I think the pose that someone is assuming, especially within a social construct like homecoming, those poses have a lot of meaning, but their meaning shifts when you're photographing them from the side, because they're really formatted to be for the camera from only one angle. So I think there's a lot of, I always think of it as like an unflattening or an unpacking or complicating of something that we're really used to, viewing over and over again as a cliche, and I think that that's, working with cliche is like a through line in all of my work. I'm specifically interested in moments that are over documented, but perhaps a little bit underappreciated, right? Like, or we don't quite think that they're complicated, but they're really complicated. So I think that for me, those strategies are very much part of, how I navigate, what you're asking.
And Tommy, on the flip side of that, your work is very personal. You often are in the pictures yourself. You photograph your mother and other members of your immediate family. So what are some of the challenges that you face in making pictures of people that you're very close to? I think you touched on this a little bit about like disagreements with your mother, but like I'm so curious because I think there's this sense of like, oh, like you know everyone. It's got to be so easy. You know it inside out. It's so intimate and familiar to you. But you've already hinted that it's not.
Yeah, I think the challenge is every time I photograph the same person, even when time has passed, I always think of like how can I do it differently than the last time. I do luck out with people who are either related to me or familiar with me, that if they know if I'm coming over to hang, like I'm bringing a camera, and then they'll either like walk out the room and then they come back with a different outfit on. That's my mom, that's my aunts. Sometimes my grandmother has done that too, but I try to flatten, or at least like do a more through line between strangers and family, because I think there's such a, when you point the camera to somebody, there's just this inherent thing that we do. Like, it's not like we immediately know how to pose, but there's like a switch to, adjusting ourselves, or this kind of performance that sort of happens for the camera, conscious or unconscious. I think that is something I'm really trying to explore more, even with spaces that are without people. I feel the same way of like, oh, how can this be more interesting, or what could it be what would it look like if I moved over here? But I always just try to leave enough room to be surprised. Like, I think that's like the motivation is just like, if we're gonna keep doing the same strategies over, it's just to allow room for surprise. And it's just the magic of picture making for me. It's just really wonderful that it can happen with strangers, empty spaces, to people I'm so close with. And I just want to hopefully continue that.
Do you have a sense that they trust you more because they know you, or that because they know you so well, they're even more skeptical about what you're trying to do?
Well, yeah, especially if I'm not as clear sometimes, because it's a lot of ideas going through my head, and sometimes they're very much like, can you back up a little bit and just, start over? It's like, I kind of like the trying to find the words, this kind of find the pictures, but I think it's a little bit fun for us, because that is like what we can't plan for. Like, we plan for the time to be together to do the shoot, but then even with strangers too, it's just that kind of brief relationship that does happen that I'm most interested in.
So I have to say I can relate to that feeling of the rush of ideas that are coming from Tommy and trying to make sense of what it is that you want to do. I think we encountered that.
I'm surprised you got in the car.
Well, but it's a great segue to the next question, because both of you present your work in ways that are fairly unconventional, at least by museum standards. And let's start with you, Tommy. But like, how did you arrive at some of these ideas? You put pictures in corners. There's a row of snapshots that go all the way around the gallery. You hang pictures on top of other pictures. So you kind of break a lot of the rules that we have in terms of museum presentation. So how did you come to that way of showing your pictures, and then what do you like about it?
Well, I definitely had to deal with having a lack of studio space, because there is this continued perpetuation that photographers just don't need studio spaces, and so often it's like, oh, we're out in the world, the whole world is your oyster. It's like, yeah, but I don't have one of those shuck things like to open it right now. But it's it's been like several years developing it, because it's a lot of trust and a lot of leap of faith with, I think working with Natalie Karg was the first time I've felt supported by a curator, especially after I explained the idea, instead of getting like, what the F? Because this I can't cuss because this is being translated, and I don't want to be on the record for that. And instead, it was just like, yeah, let's do it. It's like, okay, and that was the first time, like folding pictures, and then in combination of doing some festivals in Europe in 2019, I was told like, oh, we've already been doing this for years. Like put like sticker paper on the wall and like, well, I haven't seen anyone fold it yet. No, we've done that too. Like I have not myself in this side of the States, and I don't really care if people already done it. It's like, I love the idea that there's things that kind of echo and loop in photography historically or academically or through the community of doing self-portraiture or a certain genre. That it really kind of connects me with like a broader audience, I think, or at least just having fun with it. Yeah.
I don't have a very loud voice. So I think with your work, it maybe comes through a little bit more in terms of scale. Like the kinds of pictures you're making are bigger than I think we're used to encountering those kinds of pictures. Certainly with the homecoming work is a little different. So talk about that, because in this show, and this maybe is a little tame for how you present your work, but you're often more experimental in the way that you present your photographs.
I mean, in the spectrum of experimental, I'm still pretty straight, but I think a lot about the body, and I think I remember an exhibition that I had in Chicago before I moved to Atlanta, where after you have a solo show, you look at the work and you're your own worst critic, and I remember just thinking about how flat everything was, and how strange it was that I was photographing these three-dimensional bodies, and that they had to show up in this really conventional way on the wall. And I didn't want to do anything wild or crazy at the time, but this is the whole point, right, of artists showing over and over again. You get better every time. You learn what not to do. You learn what you loved. You learn what you hated. But with every show, I try really hard to think about the manifestation and the material delivery as matching the content of the work. So I had a show at KSU that was curated by Sarah Higgins, who I see in the audience, that was also very much about the body. And in that show, I printed everything on a really temperamental silk, so that when you walked into the room, the photographs almost moved away from you with the air being displaced. And that was because the conditions in which I was photographing were very volatile, and I wanted the photographs to respond a little bit, because if the bodies I'm photographing are experiencing some distress, I wanted the viewers to have just a tiny echo of that distress in the exhibition. And the same is true of Truth Told Slant, and the homecoming images, which are presented. This was an actual homecoming dance. These are actually people who showed up at the dance and this is the only time in my 14 years, I think, at GSU that I've ever photographed at GSU. It was in the middle of COVID, and for that reason, people were photographed by themselves, So there was sort of a limp gesture. I mean, then they went and danced together. So I'm like, there's all these funny hypocrisies about COVID. It's like, wear a mask, but then take it off as soon as you dance. And I'm like, what? But they were photographed by themselves, by the official photographer too. So I was photographing people that were alone. And I remember thinking, well, their official photograph, ostensibly, I assume, would be framed and put on a mantle in their parents' home, or maybe their home. And how could I get closer to that manifestation without it being cheesy or cringy or over the top? And so I just took them off the wall and let them sit, on a pedestal. It's a very simple removing them from the wall. It wasn't supposed to be like, oh, wow, this must be a mantle. I didn't recreate a living room or anything, but I wanted there to be just like a tiny bit of that formal approach that came into the museum, Because I think it's important when you're dealing with the body also at that scale, at full scale, that the body gets to be in the exhibition. So these are printed at life size for the most part, and I wanted it to feel like there were 4 bodies in that room.
So one last question, and then we'll open up to the audience. So both of you take on pretty serious topics in your work, rites of passage and the formation of identity, and of how your identity is formed in the context that influence kind of how you became yourself and how you tell that story in pictures. But both of your work is kind of funny, and so I'm curious how humor plays into your work. For example, Jill, I love the picture of the girl kicking and crying. There's just something about that just I could laugh every time I walk through the gallery to see that picture. And then Tommy, the picture of you and your mom, where you're kind of like peeking up, and I don't know. There's these like really these little gestures that get me, and so I'm curious like how you use humor.
Okay. I think when people laugh, I think it's like a deeper confirmation that they understand the punchline or the joke. So I really like the idea of art should be funny sometimes, and I think combining both the seriousness and the humor approach for me is like something I kind of read with Sony a few years back, and it really summed it up as like, oh yeah, Greek playwrights believe that tragedy and comedy are the basis of human experience, and it was like, yes, exactly. And I think there is something to kind of validate those pictures, just to be a little bit tongue-in-cheek, but also that there is something kind of, not sinister, but there's something kind of more to the picture that is already cutting off something or framing something out that is something that repeats itself throughout photographic history. That I don't know if I'm trying to combat it or just to create my own kind of space that is open to all kinds of possibilities. But yeah, I just like to try to have start with a clever 2-liner and cut them in half when I make pictures. That's at least that is my thought process.
Did you say a clever 2-liner cut in half?
Then I cut it in half, yeah.
It's not clear if it's working. I'm just saying, if you ever have to use it. I think life is really funny, and I think particularly, I think there's some, I don't know how to say this without maybe offending people, but it's like there's strange lines when you look back at your adolescent experience and you think about all of the things that were so important, right? They were like the most important thing in the world. And then you have decades of experience looking back on them. There is something funny about the way that those experiences now vacillate between incredibly serious, potentially traumatic, and then very funny, right? Like they move around and they're very slippery. It's not for me to say whether someone else's experience was funny or traumatic, but when you're photographing these moments, and especially the image of kicking while crying, this is another example of the ingenuity, the agency, and the brilliance of the person I'm photographing. Because when I asked the young woman who I photographed at a talent show, "What is your talent?" she said, "I have a very interesting talent. I was a cheerleader and I learned how to cry while I was kicking." And I was like, keep a straight face, just act like it's normal. We don't want to, I was like, yeah, that's really great. We'll do that. Kicking, but I couldn't have come up with that if you had paid me. I had no idea. I mean, it worked out. It was really interesting. But I will say she was also, in a very serious way, she was very proud of the fact that she could cry on cue. And that's because she wanted to become an actress. And learning to cry on cue is something that, I'm speaking off the cuff here, I know nothing about the world of acting, but it's something that they take very seriously. So the fact that she knew how to cry on cue while performing her cheerleader tasks was a big deal. And I tried to photograph it. I tried to bring a certain level of seriousness to the photograph and a certain level of formality. And again, that's back to what camera I use and the distance that I build in and the portraiture techniques, the formality. But where would we be if we weren't laughing a little bit at what it's like to be a human being, especially a social human being in the middle of the adolescent years, or teen years, so.
Thank you. Should we open it up to questions? Yadira has a mic back there if anyone has a question.
Hi, this is wonderful, by the way. Y'all are wonderful. I had a question about when you said consent, is that the act of getting the participant involved, or is that also a level of legality?
I guess that's probably for me. Okay. It's both. So, I'm trying to think of how to make it this short and interesting. So, there's a lot of layers. A lot of students ask me, like, if I photograph a stranger, should I have a waiver with me? And what should the waiver say? And where did you get the waiver? Or a photo release? And I hesitate a little bit because there's a little bit of, not because you shouldn't do it, I do it. Every single time I photograph, every single person has signed a waiver, or their parent has signed it, a teacher has signed it, a lot of people have signed it. But the reality is I've never used a single waiver in my entire life of photographing thousands and thousands of strangers, because if I ever got to a place, in the process of making an exhibition where someone said, I really don't want my photograph in that show, I just wouldn't put it in the show. I mean, I have enough photographs where I wouldn't get there, right? But I do it so that there's extreme transparency. It's like, this is their likeness, and they're being represented and they're recognizable, and I'm not doing any altering, beyond the obvious like color corrections and print corrections. I'm not changing anything about these photographs. They look like the person. And I want everyone to be comfortable. So the consent applies to, can I take your picture? Are you interested in doing this? And then later it applies to some feeling of security between both of us that they know it might go to a museum. There's, the woman who's kicking while crying is on a billboard in Atlanta. And, she's really excited about it. She sent me a lot of DMs on Instagram about it. She does want to be tagged, I will say. Okay. I was like, okay, got it. I'm like, I don't know how to, so if you took a picture, I'll give you her Instagram handle. But, there's a lot of moments where you just want to make sure everyone's okay with what's about to happen. Because, I think about people like Catherine Opie or Renika Dijkstra, people who have photographed folks throughout their entire lives. And I imagine, I have no knowledge of this, but I imagine they would do the same thing. I can't imagine getting all the way to an exhibition, especially on the level that they show, and then being like, no, I must show this portrait even though this person really doesn't want it in the show. It's like, no, just, move on. There's enough. But who knows? It's to make everyone feel comfortable and to make sure that you don't have to get to the point of needing a legal intervention.
We have time for one more.
There's one back.
Hello. You semi-answered my question, but you both photograph people, and I know, Jill, you said for the most part you pose people, but I'm curious how you get people comfortable in front of the camera, because I kind of struggle with that, and I'm curious to know how you deal with that, how you go about doing that.
How to make people comfortable. But I think part of it, just to jump off from the consent, is we're building a lot of trust. So I really try to do a good job, try to be open about my intentions with people and trying to tell them where it might end up, because these are people I am going to revisit, and it has to deal with a lot of trust. So pointing the camera in front of anybody, really, I end up reiterating, it's like, if you're uncomfortable, that's fine. I'd love to photograph that, because that's real. That's a real feeling, and I don't think that's represented enough in pictures, I think. Because some of it is just either too Renaissance-based, like sitting in front of the camera for hours or like a few minutes. But I really like if people are awkward or just trying to be who they are. It's like, I kind of encourage that, because I don't want to change like what, give that much direction. Like maybe a pose if they would move their arm, but I don't want to change how they're feeling if it's awkward for them. Yeah, that makes it more real, and sometimes you just can't plan for it. Some people are good models, some people are just everyday people, and I invite all of that.
I would say that too. Yay. The only thing I would maybe add is to be very patient. Yes. Like I think in teaching you see a lot. You encounter students who are uncomfortable or they're wanting to know why a particular photo shoot didn't work out for them. And then I learned that they walked up to one person, asked, that person said no, and then they left, and they're traumatized. And I'm like, oh my gosh, I get turned down all the time. 90% of my asking people is getting told no, and having to deal with feelings of failure and rejection a lot during the process. By the time someone says yes, it's like I'm going to be really patient with them while they're figuring out how they want to be, and I'm not moving very quickly anyway, so they have a lot of time. So patience would be my advice.
Thank you, Jill. And hello. Thank you, Jill and Tommy. With that, we conclude our first panel. We will be taking a break. There are some refreshments out on the breezeway if you would like to partake in that. And we will see you back at 2:45.
Thanks, y'all.
All right, thanks everyone for sticking around. I should mention that, in case you didn't notice, we do have books for sale by all of the artists in Truth Told Slant, and the 4 that are here have all very graciously agreed to sign copies of their books if you would like that. So after this wraps up, they'll all be out there at a table with pens in hand if you would like to get your book signed. So we're gonna dive right back in and with Rose and Kristine, and I want to start in a similar place where we did with Jill and Tommy, but arguably both of your work is the most slanted of all the artists in the work in terms of the way that it's the more
guilty. Ooh, that's loud.
Did you wait?
That's shocking.
You have so much power now.
I'm not used to being on stage. Okay, sorry.
That's not true. But I guess you both take a very nuanced, maybe somewhat oblique approach to the way that you address your topics. Rose, your work is kind of abstract and experimental in certain ways, and Kristine, you're thinking about how images, and ideas from the past kind of echo into the present. But how do you think about your work in terms of documentary practice, and how did you arrive at the strategies that you employ to make the pictures that are in the exhibition? Do you want to start, Rose? Oh, sorry, Kristine. We practiced a lot for this one.
Yeah. Well, I definitely think of my practice that stemming from a documentary tradition of looking at place. So I think documentary photography has been about going places and depicting place and showing that place through images. And I have done that with multiple projects in Cuba and Miami, which this work is from a book, A More Fluid Atmosphere, of work made in Miami, and then also Panama, and now also I'm making work out in the American West. And I'm really interested in looking at place and how place has been depicted in photography, history of photography. But I always also rejected this idea of photographic objectivity, which I think this is kind of what this whole show is about. And I think it's more interesting to come with a personal perspective. So from that point, my work kind of veers into a more poetic or conceptual space.
How about you, Kristine?
Yeah, I mean, I agree, and I do think it's kind of the premise of the show, but if I reflect back on, my mentors and this, sort of school of photography, of which I think my work stems from, and Tommy mentioned this, like Walker Evans and the idea of sort of lyrical documentary, which is to say, we're working in the world, and I do generally believe the world is going to offer more interesting things than I could in my own mind. Like I'm interested in place, and I'm interested in people, and I want to be out in the world. But at the same time, I think I'm super interested in interpreting that or synthesizing that through my own experience. So. The more I work, the more I think when I'm sort of in a situation or in a place or with somebody is how do I interpret this into the way I'm feeling about this? So it becomes, an interpretation of place. And I think that's like on the spectrum of true, right? It's just like, I don't even know if there's an objective truth when you have a camera in your hand. It's, you're still putting a box around things, and you're excluding things, and you're excluding certain moments, and you're deciding on other moments. Like all of that is subjective. But I do, as just like a general course, like demand that my photographs, in the editing process, I sort of demand of the photographs that they're doing something else on top of that.
And, as we've been talking this afternoon, I've been thinking we keep throwing around this term documentary, and I think based on the way that our conversations are going, and the way that the exhibition is set up, I hope this is clear that it's a term that I think is kind of challenging and rather inadequate. And so when I say documentary, I think in some ways I often preface it with for lack of a better term, because I having worked in this field for most of my career, in this realm of photography, like I haven't come up with a better word. I haven't heard a better word for this kind of way of making pictures. And I think kind of that is one of the ideas that I find most interesting, is kind of like rolling around this kind of challenge of imaging the world in a way that is sort of authentic and that kind of deals with that reality, but also the slipperiness of that reality.
I would say it comes up, I know when Jill was talking about how we present ourselves to others, like here's what I'm doing, in the best case scenario you'll be in a museum, like that, that conversation usually starts with, well, what are you? I'm a photographer. What kind? I'm an artist, right? If I say I'm an artist, they say what kind? I say photographer. And so it's like this dance where you're trying to say, like, I'm interested in reality, but like I'm interested in you or this space, but I'm also interested in me, like, and how I feel about it, and what context I'm going to bring that. And if people think that a journalist is not supposed to have that layer of intention, they are supposed to be more objective, then that's like the layer you bring to the table in these conversations, or even when you're alone in place and you think, okay, that's the difference between the journalist's job and my job.
I think it's also taking like a layer of like criticality to the work too, and to like the history of photography and the history of depicting space and place, and like what has come before. I think about like how places are imaged in the past, as well as I imagine you do too.
Yeah.
And I think that maybe having the three of you are also professors, but I have an MFA and went to school and talked about image theory and all these things, and I think it's hard to kind of just go about business saying I'm a documentary photography when that like lens of criticality is there, and you have to also address like who's making the images, and the fact that they are images themselves. Like the medium, I think, is really present in a lot of our work.
For sure. And I think like there's a generation before us that in some ways would deny that importance of the medium, of the intermediary, but yeah, I think we embrace it.
Yeah, I agree.
Or there's even a generation, particularly like in the 1980s, that just kind of turned inward, and there was this sense of like, well, the world out there is not, it's too fraught, it's too complicated, and so I'm just going to photograph me, my family, like this very tight knit world, and in some ways, like that was really limiting. I mean, some amazing work was created doing that, and yet, I think more recently there's been this sense of like, well, let's figure out a way, like let's go out into the world, let's figure out how to do this and do it in a way that is, that kind of gets into the trickiness of that.
Yeah, the most successful work for me as a viewer is work that goes between the personal and the political. And even if you're telling a story about your own life, that it becomes like a bridge to somebody else's life or to what's going on in a wider political context. And so I think there's like a middle ground that maybe we're all trying to find.
Yeah.
We did decide over snacks earlier that if anyone can come up with a good term for this middling thing we're talking about, this mid-space, we might have a prize.
Yeah.
Language just feels insufficient sometimes.
Absolutely. Yeah. So the tone of your work is really different, and yet there's a similar sense of, I guess, earnestness in the way that you both make pictures. And so I'm curious about what are some of the ways that you create a sense of authenticity with your photographs? Because there is something that feels genuine about how you're trying to image the world.
Well, if you know me, you know I'm frank and very candid about most things. You know how I feel. But no, to be serious, I think I'm not going to make pictures unless I'm really interested. To get up, to get out of the house, to get the tools, to go on the drive, to hike. It's like a lot of effort, actually, to make work. To make my work in particular, I do a lot of traveling, a lot of searching, a lot of failing. And if I'm not interested in the process, it's just simply not going to happen. And that process includes all the failure, all the all the ways in which the pictures don't work. But I'm in search of the pictures that will work. And so if it feels authentic, it's because I am genuinely interested in the process, and it's what I want to do with my time. That's just the best answer I can think of to that question, which is there's plenty of things I do in life that I'm not super excited about. I think all of us have those things, but photography is just not one of them. It's the thing that I'm most excited to do.
Yeah, I think for me it's two things. While using some performance in my work, I always have this quote from a friend during grad school who was also experimenting with performance in her work, and she said that, we're mining performance for authenticity. And I think, sometimes even things that maybe are a little staged can feel more real or more true than things that you come upon, So I feel like it's like being open to that. And also in the editing, because I take a lot of, like Kristine said, there's like a lot of stuff that, like, the viewer's not going to see. And so if I'm like making images that don't feel sincere to my vision, or feel like I'm just regurgitating things I saw before, or where it's something performed and it just fell flat, like, the editing I think is so important. And looking at your proof sheets and then choosing the image that is the most earnest or most honest or conveys what you were looking for in the best way. So, yeah.
And Rose, with your work, I mean, in addition to editing, the installation and the presentation of your work is so important to conveying the meaning or creating the experience of viewing it. So tell us about your approach, and I hope you've all had a chance to see the show at this point, because it's really difficult, I think, to describe what it's like seeing the pictures in the space. And then why does this approach that you've used for a few different bodies of work, why does it work for the way you make pictures?
Well, I started installing my photographs in a more installation-like way after I had published my first book, El Libro Supremo de la Suerte, which is work I made in Cuba about a Cuban Chinese number system. And there was different size pages in the books, and that was really to create different relationships between the images and to not just have the images live in this like very linear space, because while there was a narrative, it wasn't a linear from page 1 to page 100 narrative, and I wanted to be a little bit more dynamic about how somebody might be moving through a book. When it's a pretty closed venue, there's not too much you can do with a book, but So when I was trying to translate that book into an exhibition, the curator and I, who I was working with at the time, Paula Kupfer, we decided that we would overlay images to create kind of more dynamic relationships between the images, and also changing sizes of images so that it almost calls people to look closer or to see something from far away, and have, trying to activate the space. So every installation is going to be different, depending on the space available. So that was like the premise. And then I also realized that all my projects are kind of nonlinear in that sense. And I don't think images live by themselves. They need to interact with each other. So in my installations, I try to kind of encourage those relationships. I think there's a natural relationship between sculpture and photography. I photographed, a pile of palettes, and I was like, this is not a very good photograph, but I like the pile of palettes. And that led me to think about, what if I just made this pile of palettes? And, I decided that I should eventually try it. And so I painted some palettes gold, and then, over time kind of developed a spiral pile to give it a little bit more intention. So that's why there's a sculpture, in this exhibition.
And a shout out to our installation crew for painting all of those palettes and going with us on that wild ride.
Yeah, that felt like a moment that I've made it when I have people painting palettes for me. It felt great, yeah.
Fame and fortune. So Kristine, Dark Waters addresses ideas about history and mythology, and many of your photographs are speculative, or they kind of employ a degree of fiction. So I'm curious, how do you address the challenge of photographing subjects that may no longer exist or may not ever have exactly existed? And then how do you bridge the gaps of time and imagination?
Yeah, this is the first project of mine where I stepped boldly into the unknown, which is studio photography, something I had not done prior. But leaving that aside, which I'll get to in a moment, when I decided to photograph the American South, and I wanted to, reflect on what we believe about the South, what we culturally absorb about the South, what we culturally absorb from the South. The South is big. I grew up here. I grew up in Georgia. I had to give myself some architecture for how I was going to move around, and that started by reflecting on a river that I grew up near called Murder Creek. And I was thinking about, how interesting how the history of violence can still be sort of in the landscape, or maybe even celebrated in the landscape. So I started looking for more bodies of water that might have these kind of ominous or violent names, and it turns out there's a lot of them. So I built these maps, and I would drive around, and I would sort of challenge myself to make pictures, and I found out really quickly that that's a lame reason for a picture to be good. It's just not, you can't sustain this kind of niche observation into, photographs that are going to have sort of durational interest to them. So sort of reflecting back to your first question, I started thinking, okay, yes, it's literally about the name, but isn't it also about deliverance? Isn't it also about what I've absorbed of the South, or what I think is a potential here? So I'm not speaking directly to, in most cases, I'm not speaking directly to an actual history. I'm speaking to an implied history, and also a kind of general perception that feeds the way we view what's possible in the South. So the test for me, and back to this question of subjectivity, was, can I go to these places and make pictures that feel, that I can sort of translate that vulnerability that I feel here, or I can translate something of that unsettled feeling in this place. That sort of became the challenge. There are other pictures in this body of work that, I happen upon, pictures of things that have happened or people that I meet as I'm moving through the landscape. Those pictures happen very, very quickly. And it is through the context of everything else I'm bringing to the edit and to the sequence that points to history, right? So I'm bringing in murder ballads as an example of a sort of celebration of violence that sort of doesn't ultimately originate in the South, but is most celebrated in the South. I mean, actually, a lot of those songs come from the British Isles, but are repurposed in an Appalachian tradition. And thinking about things like Deliverance and these sort of iconic movies and sounds that we sense when we're alone in the forest or when we're walking through these kinds of spaces. And so anyways, as I bring all of these elements together, the lyrics, or in the case of the exhibition, there's a video installation that points to the murder ballads and the kind of the unsettling nature of them. They're both entertaining and unsettling at the same time, but all of it together, I guess that this is a roundabout way of saying context matters. And all the other elements I'm bringing that live beside these pictures, including the studio portraits, which is a bit of a, like stepping outside of my comfort zone and making those. But for me, that was like, oh, how do I rewrite these stories, or how do I disempower these stories? I have to offer a new ending. That's part of the story. That's sort of part of the rewriting of the history or reimagining of the history.
So I want to build on that, because you mentioned that the work is inspired by folk songs and kind of storytelling, I guess like a form of, again, like an oral tradition in some ways. And the pictures, they all kind of, they talk to one another in a certain way. So I'm curious, like, how do you create that sense of narrative, in the exhibition or in the book? Because the book goes into much more nuance than we could in, a dozen pictures in the show.
Yeah, I mean, it's just, how do I do it? It's magic.
Tell us all of your secrets.
This was difficult work to edit because, again, it was the first time I had allowed myself to really employ different photographic languages towards the same goal. And I became really fascinated with how that began to work, how the pictures that were fully constructed could work with the pictures that were made in an instant as I walked by, that could work with the pictures that I drove 7 hours to some stream to make, and that oftentimes I find people think that some of the pictures that were made really quickly were staged, and some of the pictures that were staged were more, kind of true documentary, and the slipperiness of that to me is super interesting. But I think it's part of why the work hopefully feels really rich, is because there isn't just one read. There's like kind of a conversation between the pictures that is really reliant on, I think, these different photographic languages being in conversation with each other.
So in the vein of working in different kinds of modes, Rose, you, in addition to your work as an artist, you do a lot of editorial assignments and journalistic work. And I'm curious how, if at all, these two facets of your work inform one another, if they ever overlap.
Yeah, this is something that I, it's an identity that I struggle but think about a lot. I have a photographer that makes books and exhibitions and artwork, but also I work freelance as a photographer, and sometimes it's hard for people to wrap their heads, especially like in the art world in Miami. It can be like that medium is so, you can get put in a box being a photographer really easily. That's why I think I'm like rebelling and making sculpture. But I think all of my work, whether it's for a mass media platform or for myself or for the viewer, everybody out there, it tries to, I try to address similar issues. So whether I'm thinking about globalization or the environment or social justice, in my work it's maybe like more poetic and more obtuse, and I think that is important too, that art that deals about important issues of our time, like there is art about it, because I do feel that like art can be effective and can stimulate change. But I think also there's a place where that making pitching a photography project about an important environmental issue, like I recently did in Florida about sugarcane burning. It's a great venue. Rolling Stone is where I ended up publishing that project, but that's like a great place for visibility. And so I think that sometimes, yeah, you can address things using very literal photography, a very literal platform, and maybe that's even more direct and more effective, sometimes. So I feel like I am lucky that, that is my gig. And it's also a way to think about kind of how photography functions in mass media. And I think I also kind of critique that within my own work. So they definitely, do work, like they feed off each other, and I work in different modes, like you said, different modes of, and I think it's also made me a little looser in my personal practice. But sometimes when I'm shooting for myself, I'll be like, whoa, I'm shooting in a very editorial way, and that sometimes I have to kind of like get out of to be looser, and to not feel like I'm just doing this portrait for the New York Times. But I also think that's also why I'm hired for those things, is because I come from I take a different artistic approach, so they look a little different. But yeah.
I mean, this is one of the things that I love about all 5 of the artists in the show, is that you're all taking on these big, pressing social, cultural ideas, and you're kind of working in a lot of the same territory that documentary photographers have dealt with for generations. And what's really fascinating is you all take a much more poetic or lyrical approach to it, as a way to make these ideas accessible. There's not this sense of there's a preachiness, or that you're kind of pointing and kind of castigating or lecturing about it. And so that the work is really accessible, and it's more about kind of experiencing these issues or finding an access point to it. So I'm curious, with that in mind, and you've touched on this a little bit, but do you think about your work as a form of consciousness raising or activism? Does that come into the way that is that one of the results that you want to have of your work?
Yes and no, which is the perfect answer to that question. I love the ambiguity of photography. I think that you have to embrace the ambiguity of it if you're really going to have a life sort of committed to this medium. You just learn more and more how fluid, the meaning of pictures can be based on where they are, what they're next to, what time it is, who's looking at it. I could feel one way today and another way about. There's several pictures actually that, in this body of work alone, that at first I thought no way, and then 6 months later it was like the key photograph. To me, it's just such a fluid thing, but for the audience, it's also fluid. It just kind of depends on what you're coming to the work with, how you're going to react. And I think there are certain things we do to guide the viewer towards certain relationships or certain ideas, and I certainly want people to walk away having felt something, but also maybe going, I do think almost every movie I watch, a woman gets murdered. Or all these television shows also have abused women in them. I do want for people to have these kind of, awareness raising maybe is the best way to describe it, without moralizing about it, because I also listen to true crime podcasts. I love them. I also loved Mayor of Easttown. Great show. It's like I'm not absolving myself of being entertained by a lot of popular culture, and that happens to include gendered violence often, if you really think about it. And so, one of the things I hope people do, they may think oh, murder ballads are so niche, or murder ballads where, men are abusing women or murdering women, that's so niche. My hope is you walk away and go, maybe it's not actually, right? And that's just one layer of the work. To me, hopefully there are others and in other bodies of work. I'm hoping to just plant a little kernel there that grows. And I think it's important not to be moralistic about these things, and I think it's important to be generous with the audience and to also give them hopefully something that they want to spend time looking at. At the end of the day, I don't want to be lectured to. I want to feel invited into a conversation and maybe even seduced a little by the beauty of it, and sort of enjoy whatever art I'm looking at, but then hopefully the next layer is I walk away thinking, you know.
Yeah, I really agree with that hope for your work, and I hope for that for, you know, I think that sometimes like more poetic work, well, maybe at first it seems less direct or less effective, can have maybe longer lasting effects or like some realizations that maybe are more profound than just feeling like you're being, you know, lectured to in a sense. And I really do, though, I agree that like right now, especially like in the world today, I feel like work needs to have some kind of social, or needs to contribute to like a better world, for lack of a better way to say that. And I remember, you know, I had Carrie Mae Weems was my professor at Syracuse University, and she was like, if your work is not moving the needle to make this the world a better place, then what is it doing? And like, I don't think that everybody has to do that, but for me, that like struck a chord inside of me that like, that is why I always, I mean, it comes from also like, you know, having a family that encouraged that, you know, having artist activist friends when I was in high school, just always being socially concerned, you know, with the world. And I think that like if you are that, then it comes out naturally in your work, but also enjoying work that's open and not prescriptive, you know, and like Kristine, like if my work is kind of critiquing the way we live, the consumer world we live in, or the globalized world we live in, I also acknowledge that I am very much a part of that too. So it's not necessarily, it's almost even celebrating kind of the world we've made for ourselves, but hoping like there might be a better way in the future by looking at it. So
It is a good reason to get off the couch, you know.
Yeah.
And I don't mean to suggest, I just mean to say, getting out, I guess I'm responding to what you said about the need to do this now feels more urgent than, I don't know, I didn't live 50 years ago, so I don't know, but there does seem to be an urgency, and I do think it's an argument for getting out into the real world and making sense of it, and making pictures in it, and trying to shape some understanding and some ideas from it. Yeah, just to be out there.
So as a spot to wrap up, so one of the things that's kind of a quiet sub-theme of the exhibition is that all five of the artists are Southerners or are working in the South, and that's not something that we really put forward in kind of the way that the show was really promoted or talked about, but it is kind of a wink to the region that, you know, our museum is located in. And in one way or another, both of your work deals with place and ideas of place and kind of creating a sense of place. So I'm curious how, as you're making the work, how you think about place, and then how do you convey that to a viewer?
Okay, well, you know, my work is made in Miami and is about Miami, obviously, but I think that when I first moved to Miami about 8 years ago, I was really struck that there was so much of the city that I had never seen in images before. I know, and there was kind of this one side of Miami that was projected in imagery, but the city was like so much larger, and it was a city that, like Seattle, my hometown, was a port city, and one that really was about other places, in a sense, because there are so many people coming from other places, preserving their cultures from other places, and also, you know, pointing to or hoping to be another place. And these areas in the west of Miami that were, you know, housing a lot of like good warehouses, or you know, where there would be people living, but there wasn't really any, you know, grocery stores or services, but just industrial spaces and junkyards, basically. And these kind of in-between spaces were what interested me. And those, I think, to tell a story of these spaces, I would, look at materials and look at photograph the people who are living in them, And I also too was living in some of these neighborhoods. So, thinking about place, when being really specific about how I was depicting this place and not just by photographing specific corners or signs I would come upon, was really important to me to be authentic, So I think that, I also like the people in the space, having that time to make portraits or performances with people. It wasn't only about making, finding people on the street, which I tried to do, but also meeting people on the internet street and then setting up appointments to meet with them. So, showing a place through the people that live there was also important to me. But, yeah.
I think, it requires putting your body in front of the thing, I mean, photography sort of insists upon that as a very simple thing. So you have to be in place, right? The place you want to photograph. And then I really think you need to take time, to really tell the story of place. I don't think it can be done quickly, and I think it requires, I think Jill said this, patience too, this mining of just the layers of the expectation and the reality, and I think a lot about sort of the history of photography, the kinds of pictures that have come before me of a particular place. When I was working out west, not this project, but the last project, I was working in the American West, and I thought a lot about survey photographers, Carlton Watkins and Matthew Brady before that, but you can even think of Ansel Adams or people like this, and I kept thinking, okay, how did that define the West, and what's my experience here? So then, it sort of became something I learned over time, how I wanted to interpret place. And the same is true for the South. I mean, I grew up in the South, so I have more familiarity with it, but, what kind of pictures came before me? How did they function both technically and sort of conceptually? How can I add to that long conversation is one question I ask. And yeah, I mean, I also think a lot about it, particularly in this work. I'm quite aware of how culture informs the way we view place. So sometimes I'm pushing up against that. Sometimes I'm using that as almost a support structure for how the picture is going to function. Just knowing what most of us bring to the table. Just recently I had the opportunity to try to describe this where I was in Japan. I have a show opening in Japan today, actually, but I chose to be with you. But I found it, and this was not just an issue of lost in translation, but trying to explain this work to Japanese was really difficult because I realized so much of what holds power in this work for me is our idea of place. So if you don't have that as a starting point, it does become a little more abstract. And I think there was this effort on their part to sort of literally describe the work, and I kept going, no, it's not quite that. But anyways, it is to say, I think for me, I'm not just playing with place itself, but there's a whole other layer of your expectation of that place as being an important component of how the work functions. That makes sense?
Yeah.
Okay.
Thank you. Should we open it up to questions? I think Noah has a mic in the back if anyone has questions.
Oh, that's
One
Noah.
second. Here we go.
That's
a little loud.
Noah. I've had so many emails from Noah. Hi.
Hello.
I didn't know that was you. Sorry.
Yeah, nice to see you. Happy to run the mic. I see we already have a few hands, so I'll get that started, and we'll have some extra time for questions, which I think will be great.
Hi, hello. I'd like to know how do you both approach the idea of collaboration with the subject of your photos?
And you know, for different projects, my subjects are sometimes people I've known for years, you know, chosen family, or now I'm photographing my daughter and my mom and myself. But in this specific project, the people I've photographed are either people I've met on the street and have a, you know, more of a quick encounter with, or people who I've met on the internet and kind of negotiate the encounter beforehand, because I soon began to learn that every place I photographed, like the culture around being photographed is really different. And in Miami, walking around on the street in kind of the industrial neighborhoods, people were a little bit camera shy. So I decided that I needed to, you know, meet people and set up the parameters via email first, which, you know, ended up being great because they were like the same people I might meet on the street, but just like, you know, we talked about it beforehand. Or even there are some people I know in the photographs too. So it's, I don't know, I had a question, a prior talk where somebody asked me, you know, how do you make a portrait? And I think for me, it's like being in the moment, you know, with whoever it is, whether I just meet you or I know you forever, and then trying to read kind of your energy or how you're moving. And if somebody makes a gesture, sometimes I'll ask them to do it again. So it's really reading somebody and how they move, even if it's performed. So I think that whether I know somebody or not, like I really try to treat it kind of all the same. But definitely, you know, there's consent unless it's like from a distance, like the construction people, but yeah.
Yeah, I think it's the same. You know, sometimes I am using a view camera, so a lot of what Jill said before resonated with me, just this sort of, it just takes so long. Everyone has agreed to do it, and you spend a lot of time being still for the camera, so there's a lot of collaboration there, finding that pose. But more so with this project, working mostly digitally, you know, the photography can happen faster, and I found that changed the nature of the collaboration a little bit in really interesting ways for me. But I would agree with a lot of what was said from Rose and Jill and Tommy, which is I try to be very, very honest with people about what I'm doing, even if that includes a lot of, well, I don't totally know, but I want to try. Are you up for it? Kind of conversations, because the truth is, for a good portion of the beginning of a project, I don't totally know what I'm after. I'm just like sort of following instincts. And you know, if someone's posing for me, again, if I'm not making a picture really, really quickly, and maybe even without their knowledge, which does happen, there's a couple in this exhibition, but if I'm really collaborating with someone, it works best when they're down for the ride. Like, we're not totally sure what we're doing, let's try this, how do you feel about this? And again, you know, moving from 4x5 to digital gave me a lot more room for experimentation, for people moving through the frame, for trying things that maybe seemed super kooky or crazy, but like, I don't know, it's digital, we can try it. You know, we can look at things together, and yeah, like I think it's really interesting when it is more collaborative, when people are sort of invested in the discovery process of it. But there are other times when I'm moving through the landscape quickly, I happen to see two people. There's like the fisherman picture in this show, and there's also the two girls sort of gesturing towards the forest. Those were made in a split second. There's one frame. That's not really a collaboration at that point. That's, yeah, those two pictures, actually. So it can depend, circumstantial, I guess.
Thank you both. Any more questions? Cool.
You guys, somebody had mentioned it earlier, kind of like the whole thing where like, oh, I'm kind of making the same images as like, these images have been made before. And so kind of like, I guess that's like imposter syndrome. So like, how do you get over that and being able to differentiate your work versus everybody else's, like, oh, like this is me and this is unique to me, kind of like that?
I think we're naturally gonna make things that are in our subconscious, and especially if you've studied the history of photography, or even just, I mean, we all see images all day long. So I think making those kinds of images is totally normal, and you can't judge yourself too much for that. I just think it's like you keep going past that, and keep making, and then it's in the editing process where you don't include those images, where you're like, this is like, looks like it belongs on a postcard about Miami, or this is like an image that my best friend made, and then you find those images that are like, oh, this is me, this is my vision.
I completely agree. I don't know if I have anything to add. There's a couple of examples and I can think of where I didn't realize I was doing it at the time. I realized it in editing, like, oh, I made one of those pictures from my subconscious. And sometimes I'll keep them in. Like, I have these, a diptych in the last body of work that I just called Sommer's Summer, like, because I made these Frederick Sommer pictures, but they're cool. He made great pictures. You know what I mean? So every so often I'll just wink it in there, because it, in some way it is sort of addressing this lineage, this, I love photography, and whoops, I made some pictures that look a lot like those, but I'll acknowledge it, in a title, or I'll acknowledge it to a room full of people. That's just part of the process. But I think you are sort of addressing this thing I said about, like, how can I, if I'm going to pull myself up to the long table of, like, I think of art history as this like long dinner party or something. I don't think I'm the first person to say that, but I want to contribute to the conversation, and that means offering something new. I can't just say what he said. And I do think, like, learning what your voice is a lifelong endeavor, but you have to be interested in it. You have to be interested in making the work and reflecting on it all the time, and seeing, because it will tell you what you're interested in. It will tell you what you think about it even, but you just have to really engage with your own work, I think.
Thank you. Any other questions? Got one in the very front.
So Rose, like, you mentioned that you find the photographer like internet to photograph with. So like, how do you approach this idea? Like, find the right people on the internet, because internet is like a huge thing.
It is a large place. Yeah. Well, for this project, I was posting on Craigslist, which I don't know. This was a couple years ago now. I'm a slow adapter. Yeah. My husband wasn't so happy about that one, but I mean, I was usually like shooting in public places, or bringing an assistant along. But I was actually just like, it was a really, the project began, I was fresh from working in Cuba, and I was interested in, I thought I was interested in how Santeria, the Afro-Cuban religion, is manifested in Miami. And it became like this idea, and so I was looking for santeros, for religious people on the internet, and I put an ad out. And some people responded that, oh, I'm not like a santero, but I'm spiritual. And so then I met these people that weren't what I was looking for, but had responded to my ad, and we made some really interesting images together. So then I was like, okay, this project is not what I thought I was looking for, and is about maybe more Miami in general. So now I would post things like looking for somebody, an old person with long hair, or it was kind of, or somebody with pets. I was kind of just going with my intuition, and also posting things that would hopefully not attract a ton of wannabe models, because that's what there is a lot of in Miami, and that wasn't particularly what I was looking for. But I did work with a former actress as well, so I was kind of open. But I think it's just maybe there's better suggestions than Craigslist. But I think that putting it out, being open to the unknown or what could come your way when you're looking for something else, I think is also important to my practice. So I don't know. you know, if I gave any good advice, but that's what I did. You know? Yeah.
Kristine, you had kind of mentioned earlier how your work feels based on history, and you talked a couple other pieces of history. And Tommy had mentioned, you know, with his culture and other cultures, they're not really well documented. While you're making and culling your photographs, do you consider how your work will be portrayed in the history of our future?
Oh, do I? I think when I'm making photographs, when I'm out in the world photographing, that none of that's on my mind. I'm really focused. I have like a different kind of sense of attention when I'm going to. I'm not a shutterbug. Like I'm not just like shooting all the time. When I go out to shoot, I'm photographing, and I have this very specific sense of attention, and I get really wrapped up in it. It's all-consuming. And all I'm thinking about really is the pictures I'm trying to make, or you know, sort of being so attuned to what's happening in the world that I'll find the picture, that it will reveal itself to me. So I don't think about it at all when I'm working. I do think about audience when I'm editing, though, because I mean, for me, the high is making the picture. You know, that's the rush, that's the reason to go out. But if I'm going to put myself in a situation where I want to share the work, well, then I'm thinking about translation, and then I'm thinking about context, and then I'm thinking about scale, and you know, like all these things about how it could exist physically in exhibition, in book, and I don't know if I think so much about the future. I mean, I certainly, you know, hope that the work remains valuable, and I'm so grateful to institutions like the High who, you know, have brought the work into the collection. To me, that speaks a little bit to some idea that they're worth preserving for future audiences. So mostly just really happy when anyone gives me that opportunity. But it's not the first thought. It's just more like I'm happy when it happens. I don't know if that answered the question, but yeah.
Thank you.
When you're doing, I call it earnest realism, but it also could fit the category of concerned photography. How often do you have an almost exact image in your head and you're like, I need to make this, versus you're going somewhere and you're talking to the people and it's kind of spontaneous? Not, you know what I mean? You don't go in with a lot of preconceived ideas of what you want to shoot, what you want to capture.
Yeah, I think that preconceived notions are good as long as you can be okay with throwing them away later. You know, like you can't get too stuck on them, because yeah, we are working out in the real world. You know, I mean, I guess maybe in the studio, you know, but there's still this other factor of somebody you're photographing that you can't control. So I think it's good. You know, I stole this idea from Alex Soth of like making lists of things I want to photograph. That just gets me like going, kind of like, these are 10 things that I want to photograph in the next month, and it gives me like a to-do list. But like, even if one of those things maybe will lead me to something else that I didn't expect, but it kind of gives me like a roadmap to then cross them off, so I can, hopefully another idea will come to me, you know. So I use those things as like just like a way of working, but not necessarily like, I don't know if any of the photographs I made were like in my like I knew that I needed to make that photograph, you know. So I think it just involves a certain like openness to the unknown. Yeah.
Definitely. I agree with that completely, and I'll add that when I started making the studio pictures, you know, I mentioned that felt unfamiliar to me because I'm used to just responding. And at first I was casting them myself, and I felt like that was like too preconceived, so then I had my assistant casting for me, and it was like the Iron Chef of photography. Like we'd set up the studio, and then like, you know, now you're gonna make a picture with, you know, this person. And I wouldn't, and for me it was like, I just needed that sense of the unknown to really even activate myself. Or I found, let me put it this way, I found that it was more interesting for me when I had less preconceived ideas. There was such a formula to those pictures anyways that I needed something unknown to really spark my sort of engine, I guess, and that became a way to do that. So I think even in the spectrum of like sort of discovered to fully preconceived, even on the full end of preconceived, I would just like take away more and more control, because the element of surprise or discovery is, I've learned, is so important to me. So.
Amazing. Up there.
I mean, if you don't like surprises, photography is really not for you, you know? I think you have to really embrace the unknown and venture into the thing you can't control. That's where the beauty is.
I wouldn't usually steal a spot, but we have a little extra time. Both of you use color in really interesting ways, and I would just love to hear you talk about how you think about color in your works that are in the exhibition. I know, Chris, obviously black and white, but it's
Black is my favorite color, though, so.
Same, and I'd love to hear more.
Well, this is much better for Rose to answer, but I will talk about green. No, I'm teasing.
Nice jacket. Thanks.
Matches your curtain.
Listen, it's a brand.
Yeah, I know color communicates a lot, and I think that a lot of times we're afraid of it, or it's, you know, it can be too strong for people. And like if you go to, like living in Miami, you go to New York City and you're like on the subway and everybody's in black. And you're like, why? Like, to me, it brings a lot of joy. You know, I'm really happy to live in a city that like embraces color. And I don't have, I think it's really for me an intuitive thing. Like I'm not, I definitely think it influences how I install the work, you know, to like it can help your eye move around. But it definitely, you know, like the picture I have of this hanging leaf that's yellow, it almost feels like it has this calling to it or this warmth to it that if it was a different color it wouldn't have. You know, yellow also symbolizes kind of like wealth or a femininity, and so I think that like those kind of associations, you know, that we have with color, if you use them right, can help drive the narrative of an image. So yeah, that yellow is also in the sunflowers. There's a man, you know, taking the sunflowers from a car. So I do think about color and what it can tell us, usually in like a subconscious way, our associations with it. And in Miami, we're not afraid of color, so we have that going for us. Yeah.
I'm terrified of color. I find it really distracting. So I just, and no, jokes aside, when I'm photographing, I really, at this point in my life, I see in black and white. When I'm at that like level of attention, not really, but you know what I mean. Like I'm looking at form and light more than I'm looking at color. You know, building a book though is like this opportunity to think about how you could use color with the pictures, and you have to be really considerate and careful about it. And I will just say that, like, for me, the green pages and the green cover, we're meant to do a few things. One is sort of symbolize, you know, when you're deep in the forest and the canopy's grown over, that green that's just everywhere and it reflects even on your skin. That would be a nightmare for the pictures. They would just be all green. I would hate that. But personally, not your pictures, they might be great. But you know, it was a way of me sort of inviting something of that experience into the book. The cover of the book is like a green velvet curtain. Again, it was meant to sort of mimic that color of being deep in the forest, but also the stage. This idea of a performance, this idea of like you're about to open behind the curtain here, something like that. But otherwise, yeah, I think black and white is really, for me, a way to, I don't know, it's like one layer removed from reality, it's one layer interpreted just on the face of things, and for me that's, I guess, integral somehow to how I think about photography.
Do you ever photograph in color?
Yeah, sometimes I do, and I often have to do it for editorial work, and I find it challenging. And then sometimes I find that I just want to simplify, because, and then I'm like, oh, I'm basically just making a blue and white picture, you know, like the black and white in me somehow will find ways to oversimplify a color situation. It is just an aesthetic impulse, I guess. Yeah.
Thank you all so much. We are perfectly on time. So thank you to the three of you for such a great panel conversation, as well as to Jill and Tommy for the first conversation as well.
Thanks, everyone.